the big global risks are the pullback on the back of, that John described, the back of 40 years of printing money. And then the inflation that comes with that, exacerbated by the creation of artificial shortages, such as energy shortages as a consequence of green policy. So you have to have high inflation.
What risks are facing the world in 2022, and how might these impact on South Africa? This is a question that we at the Centre for Risk Analysis recently considered in an exclusive client webinar. What follows is a short extract from this webinar. Enjoy. But let's look at the global context, because in the last few weeks or so, in particular in the Monday morning risk alerts, you've been making some comments about some of the fragilities in the global financial system, particularly pertaining to the ongoing monetary stimulus, which has essentially been in place for the last 10 years or so. Inflation is starting to rear its head in markets like the United States, natural consequence of a lot of this stimulus. What risks are there inherent in that for South Africa specifically? Are we vulnerable to some kind of global shock?
I think we are very vulnerable, David. We are a small open economy, a small little boat on the vast oceans of the global economy. And I think what happens in the global economy really affects us quite a lot. The risks we see is that inflation may not be transitory, as reserve banks have been saying for the past year or so, but that it may, in fact, turn out to be a more permanent feature of the developed economies. The standard economic response to rising inflation is to raise interest rates in order to bottle inflation and keep it down. But central banks are quite wary of doing that, because they also know that raising interest rates may suppress economic growth, firstly, as it makes credit more expensive. But secondly, also they can see that asset prices are very highly inflated at the moment across the developed world. And those asset prices are inflated on the back of cheap money. If you start raising interest rates, those asset prices become harder to justify and harder to defend. And that creates the risk that asset prices will start dropping, slowly at first, and then possibly very quickly and very sharply. And that is the risk of the global economic contraction that we sort of have as the really, really big risk on our radar. For South Africa, what that would mean is would be quite devastating, I think. It would mean that the global economic recovery would be killed, effectively, it would die. That means that demand for commodities would go down very steeply. And commodities are what is propping up our public finances at the moment. So if those revenues go out the window, it means that our public finances will be in an even more dire spot than they are at the moment. It would also affect our currency. What would probably happen then is that we'd get a big sell-off of bonds, and that would mean that the rand would become devalued against global currencies. And that can happen quite quickly, and it can be quite dramatic. We are worried that South Africa, based on its policies, is a very fragile economy, and it is very exposed to what happens in global markets. If those developments are bad, we would be quite severely affected by that, David.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
Frans, I wanted to maybe, in a somewhat of a small tangent to that, but also related, talk about any potential global conflicts that you might see going into 2022, because just as there are economic headwinds, there could be other risks, particularly in terms of geopolitics. We released a paper earlier in the year on China's foreign policy and its view of the world, taking a very muscular approach to the territory around the South China Sea, for example. Yeah. Do you think that perhaps we could see some kind of conflagration, a military conflict that could upset the delicate balance of power in the world at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, the big global risks are the pullback on the back of, that John described, the back of 40 years of printing money. And then the inflation that comes with that, exacerbated by the creation of artificial shortages, such as energy shortages as a consequence of green policy. So you have to have high inflation. And as rates rise, I don't think, well, I'd be very surprised if rates can rise in markets and asset prices can survive that. I don't think it's possible. beyond that, look at that. That's your big global risk. Beyond that, if you look around the world, probably the South China Sea is the place to look for now. Does does China take advantage of very weak White House? It's weaker and weaker as time's gone by to make a move on Taiwan. Does that occur? Number one. Number two, also in the same part of the world, does something go wrong? You know, everyone's sort of flying their aircraft into everyone else's territory, and they're sailing their boats around each other. Is there a sort of an accident of sorts? Someone shoots down someone's plane, someone crashes into someone's boat, and does that really rattle things? That's it for next year. Beyond that, Middle East fairly calm at the moment. I don't see a blow up there or a realistic prospect of that. You've got midterms in the United States. I think those are going to be generally kind of global and market positive. See a big swing from blue to red in the US. You've of course got COVID. You might take us there a bit later this evening, and different variants, but let's leave that aside for now. So yeah, John's got the two big risks right for the world, and then behind that, keep an eye on the South China Sea in case something happens that just rattles the world a bit more than the world was expecting to be rattled. David.
And John, we've seen a lot of pressure coming from multilateral institutions, for example, global financial institutions, to implement more kind of green energy policies. And we're perhaps seeing some of the indirect consequences of this in terms of rising energy prices. Do you think that perhaps policymakers have underestimated some of the costs and trade-offs associated with renewables?
Yeah, I think that is a big concern for us. We worry that the costs of mitigation or addressing climate change might be far greater than the benefits realized from doing so. I know that the scenario that is painted is a quite catastrophic one for climate change. I think it might not be that catastrophic, but certainly the risks, the steps taken in mitigation are very dramatic. And what we're seeing at the moment is a risk that has been flagged by some commentators, is that the switch to renewable energies might be too rapid to such an extent that support for the green transition is lost amongst the population. Because Europeans and Americans are in winter now, so they need lots of energy to heat their homes, and that energy has become very, very expensive. And suddenly it becomes quite difficult to be quite so positive about wind energy or solar energy when you're sitting in your home and you have to pay double for the gas that heats your home, or the whatever the fuel is that you use to heat your home. So I think there's a risk there that this transition is happening too quickly, and that the costs and benefits are not well understood, and that the world is getting into a bit of a corner there, into a bit of a tricky corner. And for that reason also, I think that it would be a mistake to write off fossil fuels at this stage. It may be that the need for them is still so great that the world will continue to be reliant on fossil fuels for a good while longer, because the transition to renewables cannot happen fast enough.
In the Q&A saying, so is Minister Gwede Mantashe, is his energy argument correct regarding the dependence on coal and the transition to green energy for South Africa?
Partly, yes. I worry about Minister Mantashe's motivations. Certainly there are rumors swirling around the car power ship, for example, and those Turkish power ships which are meant to supplement the South African energy sector. But I think at the moment, coal is an energy source that we have in abundance, that we know how to use, that is relatively cheap. And for us to transition out of that at this stage, I think is really, really risky. Consider that South Africa has at the moment very unreliable power supply. We are plagued by rolling blackouts or load shedding. And to now transition to new technologies, I think is a big risk. So my preference would certainly be for the grid to be a lot more stable, for us to have a solid electricity supply, and then to think about the transition to renewables.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. What are the biggest risks facing the world in 2022, and how might these impact on South Africa? My name is David Ansara. This is the CRA. Until next time, take care.